Welcome everyone to an Earnscliffe live webinar on the United States midterm elections. I'm Naseem Ahmadi, Senior Consultant with Earnscliffe Strategies. And today we're going to discuss the results of Tuesday's midterm elections in the United States and really focus on what the results mean for Canada. On the ballot was the entirety of the US House of Representatives, 1/3 of the Senate, 36 state governorships, and there was also an associated series of important elected state offices, such as the secretaries of state, the position that controls the electoral processes in the state. So the results will have profound implications on Biden's political agenda, shape the American political landscape heading into the 2024 general election. Today, we're going to analyze how Canadians may be affected politically and economically based on this week's results. So I want to let all the viewers know that you can ask questions through the Zoom Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. Bud Locklear is a principal with Earnscliffe Strategies. He has over 30 years of public policy and international relations experience in both the United States and Canadian governments. Bud's professional expertise includes climate, energy, environment, and trade. Prior to joining Earnscliffe in 2021, Bud served as special advisor for energy and environment at the United States Embassy in Ottawa, where he provided expert advice and analysis to decision makers at the embassy, U.S. consulates general across Canada, and to officials in Washington, D.C. Laura Kirkamaki is a principal at Earnscliffe Strategies. She has substantial experience in public affairs, political campaigns, and advocacy. Laura previously served with federal and provincial Conservative parties, including at Conservative Party headquarters and as an issues manager in the Prime Minister's office. Most recently, she was principal secretary to former Conservative Party leader and leader of the official opposition, the Honorable Erin O'Toole, and served as deputy national campaign manager for the Conservative Party of Canada during the 2021 federal election. As executive director of Future Borders Coalition, Dr. Laura Dawson works with a binational coalition of government and industry leaders to build better borders for travel and trade. Prior to her appointment to Future Borders Coalition, Laura led the North America office of the Amazon Web Services Institute, facilitating public sector digital transformation. Laura's other posts include director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and senior economic advisor at the U.S. Embassy in Canada. And last, but certainly not least, Eric Miller is president of the RideauPotomac Strategy Group, a Washington, D.C. based consultancy. His experience includes serving as vice president for North America and cybersecurity at the Business Council of Canada. He also represented Canada's Department of Industry in the United States, and earlier in his career served with the Inter-American Development Bank. Eric has advised more than 30 governments in Asia, Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East on trade, regulatory, technology, and economic policies. So thank you to all the panelists for taking the time to share your thoughts and expertise with us today. And before we get into the discussion, let's get a quick readout of the election results. And for that, I'll turn it over to Bud.
Thanks, Nas. Well, an atypical result, but here's what we know so far. There were 35 seats in the Senate that were up for election. 31 of those have been called, and there's still 3 Senate races to be determined. As it sits right now, both the Republicans and the Democrats have about 48 seats, and there's 48 seats, and there's three left for determining the result. That's in Georgia, where there's been clear that there's going to be a runoff election, and Nevada, where the Republicans are leading, in Arizona, where the Democrats are leading. We'll see what'll happen there. In the House, there's 393 of 435 seats have been called. The Democrats have 185 right now. The Republicans have 208. with 218 seats being required to have the majority power. Finally, we get to the governor's races. There were 36 governorships on the line. 32 have been called. There's 4 that are outstanding. Alaska and Nevada both leaning Republican, Arizona and Oregon leaning Democratic. And so there's 16 states that have where the race has been called with Democratic governors, and 16 states where the winner has been called having Republican governors. So some pretty close results. With that, Nas, take it away.
Great, thank you, Bud. So it sounds like some information is still in the balance, but based on what we know, Laura D., I'll start with you. What do you think are the most notable outcomes of the election for Canada, and any surprises that stood out to you?
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me, Earnscliffe and Nas, and thanks for the question. So I'm a Canadian based in Atlanta, Georgia. So I see a lot of strange politics around me, but I also try to keep my focus on what these things mean for Canada. I'm going to start with your last question, which is what are the surprises? What we didn't see, which was slightly surprising, was we didn't see the big red wave coming through. It was more of a red ripple, but I'm going to assume, for the sake of today, that we're going to see a Republican majority in the House. Don't know what Senate is quite going to be at, but I'm going to stipulate a Republican majority in the House, and if not, I'll come back next week and we'll talk about it. And if that's the case, what are we looking at in terms of congressional action or inaction over the next couple of years? I think the most important thing to know for Canadians is the Republican Party of today is not the Republican Party that we maybe got used to under a Bush or a Reagan. It is not the pro-business, open trade, open borders Republicans. It is a Republican Party that very much owes its existence to the extreme ends, to the Marjorie Taylor Greens, and the sort of Trumplings that are very much part of that party today. And even if they're not necessarily controlling it, they're going to be performing a blocking function for everything. The more moderate Republicans, perhaps, the leaders are going to have to be focused on reining in this group that just wants to show up Joe Biden as ineffective, that his past 2 years, he really hasn't done anything. So they're all about setting up setting up the Republicans for a presidential win in 2 years. And they're going to do that by locking up the government for the next 2 years. So no new spending, no new programs. If it has to go through Congress, it's not going to go through, is my take. There's going to be very few things where you're going to be able to see new progress. So what does that mean for Canada? Well, we're probably going to see a shutdown of the government, the US government, because of the debt ceiling renegotiations. So, that's going to destabilize the US economy, and Canada can't help but get the roll-on effects of a less stable US economy. The government shutdown, of course, that probably can't do anything. I'm particularly concerned about, because I run a border coalition, I'm particularly concerned about what's going to happen if the Republicans make good on their promise to impeach a number of cabinet members, including the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Now, as you know, impeachment requires proof of bribery, treason, high crimes, and misdemeanors. I don't expect we're going to see anybody able to prove that case, but doing that examination, that investigation, is going to take up a lot of congressional time. Moreover, there's definitely a demand for a renewed focus on the US southern border, on the Mexican border. So if you've got the Secretary of Homeland Security facing impeachment, the DHS and CBP personnel that we count on to make policy and keep the borders open at Canadian airports and land crossings, they're going to have their attention and staff power really diverted to the south. So I'm really worried about what that means for waiting times and for supply chains. It's going to make a tight situation even worse. I've got a couple of other ideas about trade and economics and security, but I'm going to pass the baton on to Eric and let him jump in, and then we'll come back on some of the other stuff.
Great. Yeah. Eric, can you add on what stands out for you about the election result and what your advice to Canadians be about what to expect?
So I think from a big picture perspective, the lack of a red wave was something that was extremely instructive and important. And what this told you was that it does matter what the quality of candidates are that you put up. So there's a number of races. For example, David McCormick ran a very tight race in the primary against Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania. McCormick was CEO of Bridgewater Capital. He served in the George W. Bush Treasury Department. He more than likely would have won the Pennsylvania Senate race had he been the candidate and not Mehmet Oz, who lived in Pennsylvania for such a short time that Fetterman made a big deal of having famous citizens of New Jersey remind him that he could still come home. You had also a case in Michigan where Peter Meyer, who was a first-term congressman, but from a very prominent family in Western Michigan, was one of the 10 who voted in favor of impeachment of Donald Trump after January 6th, lost the primary, and now the Democrat Hillary Schlotkin won the district, even though it is traditionally a Republican district. So one of the things that it tells you is that if you put up candidates who are full-on MAGA, who are full-on populist nationalists, that there's a limit to what voters will accept, particularly outside of jurisdictions where the politics is wildly one-sided. And so, in essence, you could say the system works and that the Republicans may take a lesson from this and start pivoting back to the middle in terms of a political positioning. So that's something for Canadians certainly to watch and be aware of, because the narrative that you've seen over the last few years that the Republican Party is entirely synonymous with Trump. And to be clear, there are many, many Trump acolytes. And what we see with Ron DeSantis, who came out of the night on Tuesday, the governor of Florida, as the big winner, because he is Trumpism without Trump in many ways. And so he is somebody to watch. But it does mean that, like in any political theory class that you would see, that if you keep alienating the moderate members of your own party, there are not enough of the other people. And even with all of their passionate intensity, it's not enough to carry you over the top. And so it's a reminder that some of the basic dynamics of American politics still work. In addition, something that's very important as well is that in states like Michigan, where abortion was on the ballot, people took a look at that and they went very strongly to Democrats. So in essence, where the stakes around democracy, around abortion rights and so on, were directly seen to be on the ballot, people tended to vote more for the Democrats. In states where they were not as directly on the ballot, they tended to, in cases where there were more or less moderate Republicans, be willing to vote for the Republicans. And so in essence, the sky is falling idea that has become popular in the discourse in Canada around the US is something that looks out of the midterms, and it is only just the midterms, a bit overblown. And in terms of the implications for policy for Canada, I think what's going to be really fundamental is what happens to the Senate. If there is a Democratic Senate, that will mean that one branch, at least, of the Congress is not focused on merely blocking the others. But I agree that it's going to be difficult for there to be forward momentum, but it may also provide some opportunities for cross-party fertilization and incentives, because the Republicans perhaps don't just want to rerun what they did going into the 2012 election and focus only on blocking, shutting down the government and so on. So we'll have to see, but the results of the Senate in Nevada and the Georgia recount, crucially important.
We'll be watching that closely for sure. But Laura Kay, did you have anything you wanted to add?
On my end, hello, first of all, happy to be here. I really agree with a lot of what Eric says, which I guess is, it's not great if we all agree on everything during the panel, but I think it does speak to, you know, some lessons that could come across the border here in Canada. He is right that there were some candidates in the primaries that probably would have won some of those really tight races that we're seeing right now. And I think it's just an important lesson to party leaders here in Canada that when you're appealing or, you know, going after the fringe of one side of the electorate, you know, it doesn't pay off. One of my former colleagues and former strategist for the Conservative Party, Dan Robertson, had a really, really good point yesterday, which was, you know, for Conservatives, you know, pocketbook and economic issues aren't enough. If they were, then it would have been a landslide for the Republicans. People, you know, don't vote just for policies, they vote for values, you know, or against them. And I think you kind of saw that with some of the candidates in some of the races where, you know, they had very, you know, controversial backgrounds and things like that. And those are the races that, you know, the Republicans might not win in a couple of days here.
But
Well, yeah, thanks, Naz. You know, I think for me, just taking that macro view, the most surprising thing is how atypical the results were, right? Typically in a midterm, you see a pretty significant wave of wins by the party that doesn't hold the White House. And that's been the case for decades, I don't know, a century, something like that. And that's sort of unsettling. And you know, Eric and Laura D and Laura K, you both sort of intimated that candidates matter, issues other than pocketbook issues matter, and extremism might make you, you know, there's a certain point where voters are turned off. And I'm curious, I don't know what this means for you know, Canadian political parties or others, what lessons they're going to take from this. There's a variety of things on the table, but it seems to me that such an atypical result, we're going to have to dig into it a little bit to really find out what the levers were and why, and land on, is it an issue of candidates? Is it an issue of policy? If people are just standing around waving flags, red flags, saying get angry, yeah, maybe that's not enough to get you to vote for them. So I'm really going to be interested to see the sort of post hoc analysis of the vote breakdown and where things happened and why, which I know there's lots of political scientists churning through that right now, because that's going to illuminate a lot, I think, about how parties are going to play the 2024 election, both in Canada and the United States. There's going to be a lot of electoral rich thought available, I think, to pollsters and others to help set the stage for elections, forthcoming elections. Thanks.
great. Laura Kay, I wanted to ask you, given your experience on Parliament Hill, how do you think the different parties in Parliament are assessing the results?
Well, I think Bud spoke to it a little bit, just in terms of, you know, the flood that wasn't, I suppose. I think people were kind of bracing, especially, you know, some of folks on the left-wing side of the spectrum here in Canada were kind of bracing for what might come with all of these, you know, Trump-backed candidates that were supposed to have won, and what was that going to mean? As Laura Dawson was talking about, you know, was that going to completely control the agenda of Congress now, and all these sorts of things? And now that hasn't happened, perhaps to the extent that some people were thinking, I do think it's a little bit business as usual, I should say, for the government and even for the opposition to some extent. You know, I think that the federal Liberals have built really good relationships in Washington over the past few years. You saw that they were able to work still, you know, during the Trump years. So I think for them, they're probably breathing a sigh of relief here, and perhaps for the opposition parties as well. You know, I think we want to see some stability in our closest trading partners. So I think they're probably feeling a little bit better about things than perhaps they thought they would be at this juncture.
So Eric and Laura D, did you have anything to add on how Ottawa's parliamentary precinct is looking at the outcome?
I'm going to be
Good.
the naysayer, or I'm not the voice of doom, but I still believe that there is enough extremism within within Congress right now to really lock things up. So if it involves spending and it involves permitting, I don't think Canada should expect anything. And where does that fall down? Well, look at security. Look at the NORAD modernization commitment that we just saw recently. Canada made an initial commitment of $6 billion. The US hasn't announced its spending commitment. And yes, the president controls national security, and that's great. But where is that spending going to come from? Are we going to see any US spending on that, be able to pass through on that NORAD commitment? Similarly, on energy, we may have Republicans that say, "Yay, Keystone XL, that's terrific. We'll let that through now." But will we require any additional permitting or administration on that? If we do, I don't see that the machinery is necessarily there. Similarly, things like hydroelectricity from Quebec. I think that is going to be a continuing challenge. Where I see some surprising, not a big deal, is in the USMCA, actually. Even though many of us would say that it's an inferior deal in many ways to the NAFTA, it does lock in some important elements of market access and dispute settlement for Canada. And I think that the Trump supporters in Congress are going to look at it and say, okay, had the rubber stamp from Donald Trump, too long, did not read, let's just let this one pass. So if it's already in the USMCA, Kuzma, I think that's probably fine. What else are we looking at? Trade, security, borders. Again, I don't think we're going to get much in our federal relationships over the next little while if it requires new action. But I think for the Ottawa precinct, that means look at your other relationships. Look at the state and local governments. Look in particular at the consuls general, the US consuls general, or the Canadian consuls general throughout the United States. They're very effective local sources of trade promotion and business development. So I think we should lean on those folks hard. And at the same time, at a national level, let's focus on trade diversification. We pay lip service to it a lot, but is Canada really focusing on high growth developing economies that are an alternative to the US? Can't replace the US, certainly, but we need some friends elsewhere in the world to augment what's going to be a couple of years of US instability, shaky economy, etc.
Eric, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so the parliamentary precinct will look at it through a couple of different angles. So the first will be the political angle, and it will be, well, what does this tell us about where things are? And the thing with the US is it will, if you get the result that you quote unquote want, then there are examples for what you can do better. And if you don't get the result you want, then then you could say, well, the two systems aren't very similar really after all. But I do think that I think in many ways, there'll be some on the liberal side of the aisle who will say more or less progressivism works and we should go forward on that front. I mean, I really defer to Laura Kay on what the Conservatives would think, since she's very close with the inside. But I think in some ways, what the lessons are is that politics remain local, despite the fact that we tend to talk about these in a national context. And when you break down the individual races, a lot of that turned on what was going on in that particular jurisdiction. And so the challenge of a national party is when that gets amplified out. So, for example, Mr. Poilievre will have to deal with whatever comes out of Alberta and the Alberta Sovereignty Act, and what are the implications for that. Similarly, there are pieces that were put in the Republican agenda that didn't resonate. I mean, I guess most directly the abortion piece. So there's the political piece, which will get parsed. From the policy perspective, let's say, for example, the Republicans win the Senate with the most tenuous of margins. Then you get really into into a process of planning to spend the next 2 years preparing for 2024. Nobody doing much of anything. But there will be questions. Events do come up. And so decision making about Ukraine. Not everybody in the Republican Party is a great advocate for the Russian position in the Ukraine war, for example. So Senator Rich, who will likely chair the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is somebody who has been supportive of the U.S. view on Ukraine, as have a number of other prominent people. So there will be areas where you will work together. And one of the things is that nobody's really in favor of fiscal constraint in the U.S. It's just Republicans and Democrats like to spend on different things. And so there's no anchor. There are real structural problems with things like Social Security that will have to get dealt with. But alas, divided government will mean that likely the incentives to deal with that are not going to be there. In addition, I had the hypothesis that if the Republican wave had happened, it made it harder for Biden to run in 2024. But with the more measured results, I mean, Biden certainly looked like somebody who said, yes, they validated me, and it wasn't nearly as bad as everyone thought it was going to be. Therefore, maybe I should consider running again in 2024. And so perhaps the long-term story of this is 2022 makes the DeSantis campaign for 2024, and it kills off the Trump campaign for 2024. But for Biden, it also makes his campaign, and it means that it's harder for people to challenge him. So we may well have the lineup. It's just there'll be like 40 years of difference between the two candidates, age-wise.
Laura Kay, I have a follow-up for you on the context of provincial governments. They're also looking at the midterm election, particularly the governorships, and trying to understand what it means for their province. So let's take Ontario, for example. Michigan is Ontario's #1 trading partner, and the Democratic governor, Gretchen Whitmer, was just reelected. So how do you think this outcome impacts Ontario Premier Ford and his party?
Yeah, I think it's great. When our premiers have relationships with the governors that they have large trading relationships with. I think in those cases where the governors were reelected and they have positive relationships like that, that's great. And, it's also possible that the federal government might also be relying on them from time to time, right? If there's trade issues or there's certain problems that they have that they might not be able to get any traction with. I think you did see a pretty strong Canada First sort of approach to trade, which might also come in really handy now with a Republican Senate and potentially now Republican House. It's looking like, although I feel like no one really fully understands what is going on there. There's a lot of people, it's hard to almost have any of the outlets explaining things to you when you're watching the news right now. So hopefully things become a little bit more certain, but I think the premiers with strong relationships with governors that were reelected is really positive for Canada and positive for those premiers. In some cases where perhaps they changed, I think it's just, they'll go down the road of looking to build those relationships. But I think along our border with the closest, I guess, states that we have, I think a lot of them have stayed the same. So and we don't have, I guess, any new premiers other than in Alberta, which you mentioned. There might be some natural allies on that front. So I think the premiers are sometimes relied upon by the federal government, and in the case of Ontario with Whitmer getting reelected, I think that's probably positive for the relationship there.
Building on the discussion of trade, Laura D., Eric, and Bud, each of you have expertise in Canada-US trade. What are your thoughts on how the new composition of Congress may affect the trade and economic relationship between Canada and the US? And I'll let Laura D. kick it off.
Sure. Well, as I said in the last intervention, I think on the issue of strict trade agreements, Canada is probably fine I think any opportunities to expand or change may be problematic, and if that there will be these agreements will be reviewed and renewed over the next couple of years, and I still think that those blocking functions in Congress are going to continue to kick at trade with foreigners and continue to promote the America First agenda wherever they can. So that's an issue. I think this also calls on Canada to be much more aggressive in its support for domestic industry, industrial policy, energy. When I look at what's coming up with the Inflation Protection Act in terms of subsidies and benefits for batteries and electric vehicles, automotive supply chain, I think Canada needs to put a lot more carrot into its domestic programs, because the spending has already been allocated for those programs. So that's one of the few things that we are going to see American money rolling out on. And it would be really unfortunate to see Canada being left in the dust on an important initiative like that.
And maybe I'll jump in because I wanted to raise the Inflation Reduction Act and distinguish, those particular programs, which is a complete industrial policy. You're right, Laura D, of course, but I'm wondering is USMCA and the sort of traditional WTO world trading rules, how do those fit into a world where now different blocs are coming up with their industrial policy, right? So the IRA is the United States industrial policy. Canada can't compete on a dollar for dollar basis, really, even proportionally, and doesn't have, I think, the existing sort of industrial ecosystem to really benefit from the production tax credits and ITCs and other things that are kind of flowing out there. We see that Europe is actually being encouraged by some members of the administration and others to say, hey, you should do your own Inflation Reduction Act type thing. Don't worry about us. And I think Canada's really caught in the middle there. And Canada may not be able to compete with the United States, may not be able to compete with a European sort of industrial policy approach, relying on sort of trade agreements. The trade agreement with the EU, trade agreement with Mexico and the United States are sort of, in a way, almost powerless, I think, to help out. So for me, that's the real challenge. This is going forward, but we also have an interesting opportunity in that the departments that are supposed to be rolling out these things are lacking the manpower. They don't have the policies in place necessarily yet. I mean, a lot of the money is waiting to be pushed out the door once they have the systems in place to make those decisions. So I'm seeing it's almost an apples and oranges thing for Canada's economy. That is the role that Congress is going to play is a little bit up in the air too, because they are going to make decisions, and there's oversight and other things about how this money will be spent. So if we're talking about the House being Republican, that could change the composition of what they decide to put into that political hopper to create some havoc, and help people along for their objectives in the 2024 election. Another thing which I want to throw out here that has implications for the economic stance, the energy and environment stance is, we're all looking at the results coming in from we're looking at the Georgia runoff, we'll look at Arizona and Nevada. But there's certainly evidence that Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia might switch parties. And if he does, you could actually have the election results showing that the Republicans, it's a 50-50, but you could end up with Joe Manchin crossing the floor, so to speak, and suddenly you have a 51-49 Senate for the Republicans, and probably a modest Republican majority in the House, which then changes, I think, the dynamic of what you might be able to expect to see coming out of the legislature, and probably amplifying, I guess, the effects on the Biden administration's objectives.
Yeah. So Nassim, on the question of trade. So first of all, on the trade agreement side, Kevin Brady, who will chair the Ways and Means Committee, assuming the Republicans win the House of Representatives, has said he wants to get more aggressive. So this could mean that some of the frustration among the trade wonks within the Republican Party about the lack of a market access agenda in things like the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, could perhaps be dealt with. There is no trade promotion authority, so that would also be something that they would have to deal with. But on the question of the Inflation Reduction Act, we are in a world now where essentially everybody's doing industrial policy. And so the US is doing it, the Chinese have been doing it for years, the Europeans have been doing it for years. I mean, go to Toulouse, there was no natural reason why Airbus was set up there. It was industrial policy, Embraer in Brazil, what have you. We're just doing it at scale, and we're doing it on the focus of climate. And so the question, of course, is A, how do you make choices about what you focus on? And B, how do you deal with synergy? So Minister Champagne, for example, is doing an excellent job on promoting the idea of synergies in the cross-border semiconductor space. And so that's something where there are these opportunities to build linkages across the border. You do have Canada that is considered domestic for the purposes of the Defense Production Act. And so there are a lot of cross-border connectivity opportunities that can still be built that have nothing to do with USMCA, and that really can be gone after and rolled out. But fundamentally, in a world where there's industrial policy, governments, particularly governments that are not governments of superpowers or super blocs like the EU, have to make the choice of where do we want to focus, what do we want to be good at. And one of the areas where Canada could really double down is in quantum technologies, where 20 years of investments in quantum research and development across Canada, really interesting and innovative companies in that space. And this is becoming big in a lot of different areas. So maybe what you do is you go from the 350 million that was announced in budget 2021 to something much larger than that, and say we want to dominate. So much like was done with the Canadarm and robotics and the space era, this is a matter of saying, what are we going to focus on? What do we want to be good at? How are we going to put all the pieces together? Because when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, what they did was they thought about where each part of the supply chain was and how did you build that connectivity. This is not a case where we'll subsidize one part, but the other part will have to be realized in a different context. So on critical minerals, on semiconductors, take the opportunities where they are. But it's also a matter of saying, where do we need our own policies? Get those strategy documents that have been waiting out there. Get that budgetary allocation out there and say, okay, we're going to be really great at AI. We're going to be really great at quantum, and we're going to go big there and be world class there. But it may mean that some other areas where we're not going to be as focused. So life's about making choices. So in an industrial policy world, let's make some.
Laura D, I see you want to get in.
Yeah, just responding to a couple of things from Eric and from Bud. The implication with these sort of escalating industrial policies is a country like Canada and medium-sized economies can't afford to play this rich person's game, and that's absolutely the case. And that's why the WTO and regional trade agreements put in these anti-subsidies measures into the agreements, so that you could counter the subsidies with various trade measures or take them to trade court, et cetera, et cetera. But the state of the WTO has been so weakened over the past number of years that we can't really rely on these agreements as a backstop against subsidies. So that sort of instrument or tool is not really available to folks. As Eric says, I guess it's about making choices as to what's important and what's not. I also though wanted to make the point that there's a lot of trade and economic activity that takes place between our two countries and within our three countries with Mexico that doesn't rely on trade agreements, and that we can be focusing on business as usual type activities regulatory alignment, regulatory standards that affect manufacturing and agriculture are things that you can continue to get done because they don't need congressional attention. Somebody mentioned critical minerals. This is one area where we do have bilateral alignment in the United States in their desire to isolate China. So things that are going on with Canada on critical minerals should absolutely continue to go unless they require regulation or money, and joint work on things like science and technology, things that we do, agricultural programs, transportation programs, all those things that maybe aren't so sexy, but keep our economy going. There's still lots of room for US-Canada cooperation on that, no matter what Congress happens to be doing.
Eric, I see your hand up. I'll circle back to you, and then Bud, let's go to a viewer question.
Can I make just one quick point? So Laura mentioned the WTO. Remember when we've talked a lot about friendshoring of late. Friendshoring is the opposite of the WTO. So it means that we're going to decide who we trade with based on what people's values are. And so ask yourself, is that something that you want to go down the path of? You know, even putting aside the point of whether it is possible to remake supply chains, but friendshoring essentially means we want to focus on these people over here, which means that we will take the WTO, not only stop trying to reform it, but you know that the implication is to essentially throw it out the window altogether.
Great. And Bud, do we have any questions from the audience?
We do. And in fact, we have a question from Sarah Goldfeder for Eric, directed to you, Eric. How do we see this as indicative of what might happen in 2024, which could affect the conversation around USMCA, CUSMA in 2026, after those elections in both jurisdictions? Should we see the agreement as heading towards another period of real risk and insecurity, or will it endure?
So what we see is that the midterms are sending a message, but they don't necessarily carry forward into the following presidential cycle. And so you saw Bill Clinton badly defeated in the 1994 midterms, went on to win re-election handily. Barack Obama was badly defeated in the 2010 midterms and went on to win re-election in 2012, less handily, but still win. And so I do think, though, there is a question mark about if there is a populist in the White House in 2024, what does that look like? And so the ramification for Canada would be start planning now what a 2024 or 2026 renewal process looks like. This is something that has to receive more attention as the months go on, because we are effectively now entering the cycle where that is going to necessarily be on the agenda. And so a lot can happen between now and then. Does Biden ultimately decide not to run? He probably will run in light of this result. And does he win? Hard to say. What does the Republican agenda look like? Is DeSantis somebody who would oppose USMCA? I don't think he cares much about trade one way or the other. But I think that we are entering a risk period with the review of the agreement. And so, because we will have certainly something where you will have a new president in Mexico, a new president in the US, and an election in Canada that will yield whatever it yields. And so that means that whole different set of actors, which means that we have to start talking now. What does the agenda look like? How do we approach this? Are there changes we need to make? And to put somebody, the next generation, Steve Rahul, in charge to carry this over the line, and it should be something that is a national priority, not a priority of one government or another.
Great. So shifting gears a bit, we did see divisive partisan rhetoric from some in the run-up to the midterms. And as Eric was mentioning earlier, putting forward more populist, nationalistic candidates seems to have not provided the electoral success that the Republican Party was hoping for. So, Laura Kay, how might this all influence Canadian politics, especially when we're thinking forward to our own federal election?
I'm not sure it's any different than anything that's been going on recently. I mean, we are, of course, in Canada, it seems to be a couple of years behind what is going on in the US. And obviously, I mean, we are influenced by what is happening there. But I think, you know, our politics is different. It's not exactly the same. And I think, you know, I don't think that the outcome or how they've been conducting themselves during this recent midterm season is, in fairness, any different than it was in 2020 or previous to that. I think, you know, Trump changed a lot of the dialogue in the lead up to 2016. So I think, you know, in Canada, you know, things are, you know, a little bit divisive, of course, but I don't think that this necessarily has any large impact in that sort of aspect of campaigning or anything like that. I think we'll continue to see our political leaders battle it out on a range of issues, including the economy and other things that are going on right now.
Thank you. And we've talked a bit about bilateral trade and economic relationships, but Canada and the US, of course, are partners on the global stage too. So what are the implications of the midterms on relationships with other world leaders and any impacts on Canada's foreign policy goals? Eric, did you want to take this one?
So obviously the most discussed relationship is with China. So you've just had Xi Jinping reelected, as it were, in the 20th Party Congress. And so saw the news that President Biden is going to meet President Xi. That relationship is something that is very important, but structurally, the two countries are very much not moving in a direction of greater harmony. And so I think that you will see a doubling and a tripling down on the idea of the West involved in this existential struggle with China. And that will have, by definition, implications for Canada. So we shall see the Indo-Pacific strategy and what that means for Canada, but there will be demands, there will be interest in the US about what Canada is doing. Certainly the decision that was made or the announcement by Minister Champagne around the Chinese investments in critical minerals got a lot of attention in Washington. And there will be real issues around technology connectivity and what does that look like. And so fundamentally from the perspective of the relationship, the US will undoubtedly have more demands that will be made. I can see, for example, the US moving to something like a free trade agreement with Taiwan. They will gauge that very carefully. And for Canada's interest, Taiwan is, I think, the 6th largest Canadian trading partner in Asia. And if there is a US free trade agreement, things like Canadian beef and other exports that are made to Taiwan are going to need to be dealt with. So the realignment of geopolitics will, by definition, lead to different trade pressures. And so, I mean, there's a lot for Europe, the Middle East, others that we can look at, but I'll stop there.
So I would just jump in. Actually, I'm going to jump back to one of Eric's earlier points about friendshoring and sort of double down on that. Because it looks great in headlines, but it actually can be a trade diverting exercise in which you end up with people paying higher costs for products that they want to put into their supply chains. It also means that you're not necessarily cutting China out of the equation. You're just hiding Chinese products through the guise of some other seller. So they're going to China and then they're going someplace else and they're arriving in Canada. So it's not Chinese, it's fine. But which this is related to my fundamental problem with doing, economic policy that is purely driven by geopolitics. I prefer economic policy for the sake of economic prosperity. And I know that the two things are interlinked. But interestingly, you can take some of the ideas of friendshoring and look at those in the context of regionalism. And if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend Shannon O'Neill's new book on regionalism from Council on Foreign Relations, because there really are economic gains from trading with people in your geographic area with whom you have established trade and economic linkages and business linkages. That's a whole different rationale than friendshoring is. So I think Canada does need to refocus on these regional trade arrangements, whether or not it's a formal trade agreement or it's just a series of sort of more soft commitments among regional countries. Those are good places to look at. We haven't talked about Latin America for years. Maybe we should talk about trading relationships with Latin America again. That might be a nice idea. And while I see the economic benefits of an agreement with Taiwan, and the economic importance of Taiwan is unarguable, you have to recognize that a deal with Taiwan precludes any kind of a deal with China. So if you're going to do that, you have to make that commitment with your eyes wide open.
But
Well, I think what we're going to see is the House of Representatives, run by the Republicans, will push for probably a China Select Committee that will examine very closely the Biden administration's approach to dealing with China. And, it's going to amplify the protectionist urges. I think a lot of people are going to look at that and see that that is going to only add to the tensions and pressures, and, perhaps a flashpoint that would cause some kinetic friction between the two countries. So Canada seems to be on the side of this greater emphasis on kind of a focus on the, Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, maybe aligned a bit more with the friendshoring, et cetera. But the real question I think that the U.S. administration will be looking at is, well, these are good words, but we do need to see a greater commitment by Canada to spend more on defense and national security. We're seeing the economic security issues come out, like Laura, you mentioned, the Minister Champagne's position, sort of putting screws down, I guess, on Chinese investment in critical minerals in particular. And going back to something, that I think all the panelists have talked about earlier, there's great opportunity to reinforce the synergies that exist. But one area where there's not a synergy is Canada's defense posture and contribution to security. And as we move towards probably a greater sense of tension and potential flashpoints between China and the United States, is there going to be, how can Canada maybe work to diffuse, deflect, be a positive voice in there, and what is Canada doing that's on the hard side of this, preparing Canada's national security infrastructure to be a little bit more robust and capable? I think that for me might be a sort of a question that's going to come up over the next couple of years. It gets to, Laura D., you mentioned, the NORAD modernization effort. Well, yeah, maybe some of that money is going to be diverted in the USA and go towards something that's a little bit more oriented towards an Asia Pacific strategy. But what's Canada going to do to stay in tune with the sort of strategic environment that the United States is perceiving and make a visible kind of contribution somehow to resolving or maintaining the tension so they don't escalate?
Eric, what did you want to build on?
Security in the Arctic in particular is going to be something that is fundamental. So building on what Bud said, I think the US is going to look to Canada and say, you got that big swath of territory, you need to deal with it. I fully agree with him on the defense side. I also agree with Laura on the trade piece around China, because part of the trick that Canada has to master with China is that it does sell an awful lot of product to China, particularly commodities. So even when when Richardson and Viterra were barred from the Chinese canola market, Canada was still selling record volumes of canola to China. So the piece is, how do you maintain your market position in areas that are really important to some really critical parts of Canada, while at the same time advance your political and economic views? So it's no easy feat to pull that off. So, again, it's only going to get more complicated and more decisions for PMO and others to make.
Bud, before I wrap up with the last question, is there one more question from the audience that you wanted to throw out?
Well, it isn't a question so much as something in the chat, and it's basically says, do the 2020 midterm outcomes confirm that in the United States, at least, you may not be able to fool all the people all the time? I'm curious, how that fits into our emerging narrative on what went down. Laura Kay, you should take that one off.
Yeah, I actually think among some of my friends that I've been chatting with who are in the political realm, I think that is definitely one of the takeaways. I think this sort of shows that people actually are paying some amount of attention, especially on the values piece. I think people, sometimes we don't give voters enough credit, but I think when they do see something that they like, or more specifically don't like, that they're going to come out. And I think that's why, a lot of the polling leading into right up until the midterms has been proven to be wrong. There were some really, really late polls showing that there were more youth voters, but I think we also have seen a large female population coming out to vote. And there's obviously been a lot of connections that folks have made so far in American media about abortion and those sorts of things. So, I think whoever wrote that in the chat is onto something, and it is an interesting question to be posed here in our political sphere as we look to some upcoming provincial elections and potentially a federal election in the next couple of years.
So I'm mindful of the time, so I'll just ask one last question to all of the panelists. What is your top advice for Canadian citizens, governments, or businesses on what to pay attention to as the new Congress, governors, and other state office holders are sworn in January? So Laura D., I'll let you start.
My number one piece of advice is don't get distracted by the drama. Canada loves to armchair handicap US electoral politics. It's on our TVs every night, but there's a lot of, it is going to be dramatic, and it is going to be locked up over the next couple of years, but there's a lot that Canada can do. In the meantime, as someone mentioned earlier, relationships matter. Relationship between premiers and governors matter. Relationships between mayors matter. And especially businesses in Canada just need to get down to the United States day after day, week after week, and remind the folks down here that Canada is a safe, secure market, the largest US trading partner, one of the largest investors. I mean, where I'm in Atlanta, people love Canada. They just forget about it. It's like, really? Canada buys more products from the US than anybody else? It's the largest trading partner for Georgia? Huh. So again, just get out there, get busy, do business, keep those relationships fresh and hot, and try not to get too freaked out by the drama that's going to play out in Washington over the next couple of years.
Laura Kay, your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I would just give some advice to the Conservatives here and just say, don't get distracted by the culture war that is waging amongst Republicans and the right in the US and what is to come with a presidential primary. I think as Dr. Dawson said, it's really easy to get distracted by the shiny objects in the US, and there's a lot of work to be done here, and people need advocates on the economy, on inflation, on really important pocketbook issues here. And I would just say, don't get distracted by what's going on south of the border.
Eric?
Yeah, so in a similar vein, I think a lot of what you can get at times is a cartoonish view. One of the things to remember is that Not every Republican is against you. Not every Democrat is for you. You have different people with different interests. And so this is a matter of systematically working through to advance your agenda. I mean, Earnscliffe is in the government affairs business, and government affairs as a business means working with everyone who you need to work with in order to advance the interests of your clients. And in the US, you have a big group of people to get to know and to deal with. And from a Canadian national interest perspective, one of the things I would argue is that this again behooves the government to take a look not only at the footprint of government representatives in the US, but ask the question of how is Canada's message being communicated? Not so much when there's an emergency like a NAFTA renegotiation, but to ask the question of what's the digital presence look like? Who are your advocates in Rhode Island and Delaware and other states where you don't have consuls general? And so it's a matter of wholesale asking, how do we build a 21st century messaging infrastructure and connectivity infrastructure, and to not get caught up in assuming that one party's our friend and one party's our foe. It's ultimately a different country, a different system, and it's a matter of going in and meeting people where they are and looking for how you can find common ground and common interest. And as Laura says, people like Canada, but it's a matter of drawing out those connections and those stories and amplifying them in a way that is conducive to realizing whatever it is your objective is.
Last word to Bud.
I'll be succinct. Exactly what my co-panelists have just said. 1000%.
Great. Well, we are out of time. A recording of the webinar will be available on Earnscliffe's YouTube channel. Feel free to share that with your colleagues. Thanks to all of the viewers who submitted questions, and a huge thank you to our panelists, Dr. Laura Dawson, Eric Miller, Laura Kirkamaki, and Bud Locklear, for your insights and participating in a very informative conversation. Have a great afternoon.